So welcome. Thank you for coming to meet with me today. I'm just going to do a little introduction of you, if that's all right. So yeah, this is Paul. He is a mediator, facilitator, trainer, with lots of experience working and supporting groups through the challenges of conflict and kind of difficult decision-making processes, and helping them sort of think about how to develop systems and ways of working together that can be more effective and just. Um, he is generally focused on sort of supporting groups and projects that are working for social change, sort of social environmental justice. Has also done some mediation work in communities, and works as part of the core of team of Navigate, the Navigate Collective based in England. Um, and he draws on lots of different kind of approaches in his work. He's kind of spent time traveling around in the time I've known him, which is since we were teenagers. Yeah, he spent a lot of time traveling around also in the States and in the UK, kind of working with different organizations and mediators, kind of gathering and learning lots of different approaches and skills. Draws on restorative circles, convergent facilitation, nonviolent communication, MVC. He's done a lot of work with Mickey Cashtown, who people would probably have heard of. Um, and currently is exploring ways to sort of gather and draw these processes together and principles to support social movement building specifically. Does that sound right? Anything you want to add, Paul?
No, that reflects it well, I think. Thanks. Yeah.
Good. Cool. And so the reason I sort of suggested, coming together to do this conversation was, I've been working for ULEX for a long time and sort of part of the facilitation team on lots of our courses over time. And, of course, in that context, I've experienced a lot of the challenges that there are for people in our movements around working with conflict, the kind of, yeah, when we're kind of trying to work collectively and collaboratively, inevitably conflicts arise. And whenever I'm on a training and we're kind of asking people, so, why are you here? What do you want to learn? What do you want to get out of this? Like, conflict is always in the mix. And, sometimes that can be, people can be engaging with that in a way that feels sort of workable, and other times it's, can be devastating. So yeah, it feels like this really important theme, and it also feels like there's sort of gradually been a bit of a sort of shift in the culture around how people are thinking about and engaging with conflict. I mean, it's a bit of a generalization, I guess. We work with people from all over Europe, and it's different cultures, different places and stuff. But yeah, I feel like I have seen, yeah, this sort of feels like people are talking about it more. There's a bit more kind of literacy around it, a bit more of a sense of like it's important that we embrace it, and how, what are the creative things we can do with it and that sort of thing. Um, but continues to be something that is, yeah, a really big deal and really challenging for people. So it just feels like it felt like it'd be really useful to have a conversation with you as someone who's sort of engaging with this over such a long period and with lots of different people and doing lots of training in the field as well, to sort of, yeah, get your perspective on how that's going and what seems important and all that. So thank you for agreeing to do it. And yeah, maybe we could just start with, I'll ask you, yeah, what is your sense of kind of what's going on in our movements and groups around conflict at the moment? Like, what have you noticed? What's the lie of the land? Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think I also have the sense, and my main context is the UK and particularly England and to some extent Wales. I also have that sense that there is a slow change happening, a kind of turning towards recognizing conflict and beginning to pay more attention to it and to reach out for support around it or start to think about it proactively even before it's happened, or maybe people have had an experience in the past of conflict being handled in a way that caused a lot of problems, and then they take the learning of that experience forward. So I think that is something that is a slow change. I think of it a little bit similar to how understandings of mental health and trauma and just emotional intelligence, or whatever we want to call it,
Mm,
those things that didn't have much place in the dominant cultures of Western Europe, at least for quite a long way back in terms of our, the generations before us. I think
Mm,
the lack of attention on that was in the wider culture has been then carried through into a lot of social change, progressive social movement
mm,
spaces.
mm,
And as those things start to get recognized more, I think conflict is also starting to get recognized more. That's my sense as well.
mhm,
And I also think that, so a lot of the work that I do is about conflict within groups or organizations and projects that are working for social change. I have a sense that there is just starting to be a recognition of that, not only at the level of internally within a group, but also between groups, that there's a stronger recognition that the left or progressive social movements can be quite divided, that they tend to disagree or fight amongst themselves in ways that weaken their power, and something around starting to recognize the idea of working across differences in coalitions that I
mm,
think many powerful social movements in the past have done. And
mm,
there's a distinction that a civil rights organizer called Bernice Johnson Reagan makes between what she called home space and coalition space. And
mm,
I won't go into it in depth, but the basic understanding of it that I have is that it's important often for people to have a place where they aren't working across massive differences. They feel safe and at home and understood, and they have a shared experience, and that's what she's calling home space. And she
mm,
also talks about coalition space as a place where you are working across maybe quite large differences. Maybe there's huge tensions even within that coalition, but there's a recognition of a greater shared goal that it's important to come together to organize for.
mm,
And I find that distinction very helpful, and I see it as a spectrum. But if you're looking in coalition for home space, then that often won't play out very well. But if you only have coalition space and you don't have home space, then that also often doesn't give you the things that you need.
mm,
So I have a sense that there's beginning to be a bit more of a recognition in the context I'm aware of the
mm,
importance of coalition space, which I think has got somewhat lost in
mm,
at least some parts of the left. The
mhm,
idea that if you disagree with someone, or you have a strategic disagreement, or even a political or values disagreement, or that group once did something that you really didn't like, the idea that you just won't work with them or talk to them ever,
mhm,
that I think that idea is coming into more question. People are recognizing as the existential threats and crises that we're facing amplify, get more and more, uh, as we sort of cross into more and more emergency territory on so many
mhm,
different social, political, environmental levels.
yeah,
I have a sense that people are starting to recognize coalition space as a necessary thing, and I think with that are starting to recognize there's a different way of doing conflict that is part of organizing across differences, and creating and maintaining a coalition or an alliance or something that has
mm,
greater collective power by
mhm,
bringing
mhm,
quite different groups or communities together.
mm. Can you say more what you mean by a different way of doing conflict?
Mm. So I think that we perhaps have inherited quite quite a lot of the patterns that are dominant in society more generally around how we handle disagreement, conflict, tension, hurt and harm, all those things.
Mm,
So, one of a person who's been a significant influence for me is someone called Dominic Barter, and he talks about the idea that whenever a bunch of people get together, they will quite quickly have something that you could refer to as a justice system or a conflict system without them necessarily having talked about that or thought about it or put any intention into it, there's a sort of
Mm.
inheriting an implicit system,
Yeah.
perhaps invisible, or it becomes visible at the moment that something difficult happens. But if
Mm.
you track the patterns that play out, it's quite likely that it will mirror the patterns that are there in wider society, including in the criminal justice system, where, say,
Mm.
if you and me get into some sort of tension or disagreement, it's quite likely that we'll start labeling each other in particular ways that don't increase understanding or collaboration between us. You know, if I start to blame you in particular ways and say you're bad or wrong, or your actions can't make any sense to me, or I can't see any reason behind why you've acted in the way that you have that I
Mm.
could have some kind of understanding for, and maybe you're doing the same back towards me, and
Mm.
then maybe I start to say I don't want to talk to you anymore, or I want you to go away, or maybe I even send out a message in the group that we're part of that says no one else talk to Alex because they did this or that. And I'm not saying that there aren't situations where it's important for protection and safety to make really significant steps to stop engaging with someone, or
Mm.
um, not not continue working together. I think there are many situations where that's very important,
Mhm.
but there's a sort of what could be called a dynamic of punishment or retribution. So we might inherit a sort of
Mhm.
implicit or not fully recognized pattern or system, which is a punitive system that
Mm.
basically tries to figure out the logic of that system is figure out who did the wrong thing and exclude or punish them in some way.
Mm.
And I think that 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 dynamic carries through a lot of progressive or left wing social movements,
Mhm.
and we could we could do things differently than that. So rather than there being a sort of, for example, you go over there and I go over here and I talk to people who agree with me and you talk to people who agree with you, and we get into some sort of basically adversarial or competitive dynamic around what's the truth, who's right, who's wrong, etc. And we try to use power in a sort of unilateral way where you're trying to get me out or trying to establish a truth that's your truth but doesn't include me, or I'm trying to do the same back at you. We're sort of fighting in that sense. There are ways of doing conflict that would be about, once we've already run into a conflict, what would it be for us to get the kind of support and the depth of support that would mean we could sit down together and talk to each other in a way where we actually understand each other's experiences,
Mm.
perhaps start to develop empathy for each other's experiences, start to look at what were the conditions within which each of us acted as we did,
Mm.
learn about the systemic context that led to our actions playing out as they did,
Mhm.
etc., acknowledge where we've acted and where it's had impact for each other, come up with agreements to address what has happened and to set things in a different direction going forwards, and come back to a level of connection or even togetherness around what has happened and moving forwards. So
Mhm.
that's a very different pattern that
Mhm.
is a way of doing conflict differently. And I
Mhm.
think that people are starting to recognize and have direct experiences of that, and hear stories of it. There are, I think, other things about how we do conflict differently, which I could come on to. For example, what do we do before conflict has arisen to prepare for it, rather
Mhm.
than just responding to it once it's arisen? So I could say
Mhm.
more about that if that's helpful, but that's maybe an attempt to answer the question of what do I mean by doing conflict differently.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So one of the things that's coming up for me listening to you describe that is like you know, as we're saying, it does feel like there is kind of this shift, and there's kind of more literacy around and sort of awareness around in groups around like, okay, well, we've got a conflict and there's something we need to, you know, we want to try and engage with this in a kind of more positive and creative way. Um, and yeah, and I guess what I encounter a lot, you know, with, you know, hearing people's stories on trainings and that kind of thing, is that, you know, it's like there can, you know, sort of people ending up in these kind of like long drawn out processes that often don't feel like they really resolve it. It's like, you know, we're trying, but it's not really working kind of thing. Like we're trying to understand each other, but actually, you know, everyone still hates each other basically, sort of thing. And
Mm.
it's like how or yeah, the level of sort of hostility is still just like so difficult to manage. It's like there's, it sort of almost feels like there's a kind of crust on top of like the things we're trying to do well, do it, we're trying to do it better somehow, but underneath it just, it still feels like there's so yeah, real challenge to like genuinely meet or transform the kind of underlying emotions or something. Well, I don't know if it's the underlying emotions. That's what comes to me right now. But yeah, so I sort of wonder. I wonder what your sense of that is, and what how you've kind of seen things work and not work, and yeah, for people who are listening to this or reading this and kind of going like, yeah, we tried to do all that, and it didn't really work, sort of thing. Yeah, yeah. What would you say to them?
Mm. So I think for me, there's a few different elements of it. So one is, I think, going back to the thing I was just touching on around preparing for conflict. I think if we could have a conversation before conflict arises or between conflicts, if some conflict
Mhm,
has already arisen, but we've
mhm,
worked our way through that, a conversation about how do we want to handle our conflict. Again,
mhm,
referring to a metaphor that I find very helpful that Dominic Barty uses, he talks about anywhere you go in the world, in human houses, there's generally some version of a kitchen and some version of a bedroom or a bed, because people
mhm,
have noticed they keep getting hungry and they keep getting tired. So they set up the thing they need to care for that part of life that keeps
mhm,
happening
mhm. Yeah.
ahead of time, rather than trying to build your bed when you're tired each time or build your kitchen when you're hungry. And I'd say it's even more the case with conflict, because if we've already run into conflict, it's hard for us to talk to each other about how we want to handle that conflict if we're already struggling to talk to each other. So
Mhm,
having a conversation, and I think in terms of political and social change, I one way of framing it could be something like internal strategy. If you want to have an effective external strategy to change whatever you're trying to change, but you
mm,
don't have a strong internal strategy, then it's very likely that your your internal strategy will, the absence of that will take down the effectiveness of your external strategy, in the
mhm,
same way that if
mhm,
you're trying to do something and you don't look after your internal health, then you're going to struggle. If you're trying to climb a mountain but you're not feeding yourself, or you're not, whatever, looking after
mhm,
your internal well-being, the well-being of your inner system, then that's going to
mhm.
affect your capacity to do
Yeah.
external outward things. So I think that, and then setting up, not just having a conversation, but setting up what exactly and practically are we going to do, and putting the things in place so that, for example, that one aspect of that is also, I think, noticing conflict much sooner. So I think people often don't recognize that they're in conflict for a while. I think that's probably changing, but people
Mhm,
can be, for example, coming out of a meeting feeling really frustrated and annoyed with someone, and maybe they'll talk to their friend about it, and then they'll go back into the meeting and have a similar experience again 2 weeks later, and then it happens again. And
mhm,
I think if people were more able, had more support to recognize, oh, something's not working here, and there's actually something really important contained within that, they could perhaps reach out for support much sooner. And that's a dynamic that we're working hard to try and shift within Navigate at the moment. Is we find that people reach out to us for mediation really far down the line, I think often as a sort of last resort. So,
yeah.
and the way I see that is that the level of pain if you think of it as a sort of graph, the level of pain is going up and up and up, and the
Mhm.
level of trust is going down and down. And
Mhm.
also, at the same time as that, the level of capacity and willingness to engage in
Mhm.
trying to transform the conflict is going down and down. And people call at the point where trust and willingness and energy to engage has got really low and the level of pain has got really high. And it's, I think of it in a way as just quite a simple practical problem. It's like if you've been knotting up a rope for 2 years, and then
Mhm.
you at that point decide you want to try and untangle that rope, but you are really tired out at that point and you just don't have the energy. It's not that you couldn't untangle all those knots. There is a
Mhm.
specific pathway to
Mhm.
undo what has been done,
Mhm.
in a
Mhm.
sense, but the energy and commitment is often no longer there. And colleagues of mine have had the experience of people coming to us for mediation, and some way through the mediation process, we find out that someone has taken a job at another organization or something like that.
Mhm.
And so, what we're trying to do is get people to call us much sooner, to see
Mhm.
mediation as not only a last resort, or in fact not best accessed as a last resort, but something that happens. Say you and me are working together, and I find that I'm getting annoyed with you, or you're getting upset with me, or frustrated with me. There's something, there's a dynamic that's not working between us. And then maybe the first step is us to try and have a conversation. And maybe if there's enough trust and there's enough of a way to get each other and understand each other, we can work through that, and
Mhm.
we feel like, oh, that's, we've understood what was going on, we've put things in place to do things differently in a really practical, clear way,
Mhm.
and we've come back into a sense of care and connection and togetherness in relation to what was difficult between us. Then
Mhm.
maybe we're all good. But if we've tried that and it hasn't really worked, or we one of us doesn't actually feel comfortable to even have that conversation,
Mhm.
then for me, on a sort of flow chart, I want us to be moving to getting more support straight away, really, quite
Mhm.
urgently. I think of it a little bit like first aid. If you get a cut on your finger, it's probably
Mhm.
not a really big deal for most people most of the time, as long as you do the things that you need to do to make sure that's kept
Yeah.
clean, and given the conditions to heal, it will heal quite quickly. But if you were to get a cut and didn't do anything at all, and it, then the problem gets so much worse. And
Mhm.
I think it's often similar with conflict. It's, I'd like people to recognize it much sooner,
Mhm.
to have
Mhm.
put some agreements and some things in place to support them. So it's not also just on individuals. I think often, and I think some of the work that happens around conflict is still ends up with it being on individuals. So even if I'm like, oh, I'm really interested in conflict, I'm going to go to a training. I go as an individual to a training. I learn some things. I go back to my context, and then something happens, and it's on me to remember all those things and have the capacity in my nervous system to do all those things. And if there's maybe a difficult power dynamic or something like that, I need to take it all on myself
Mhm.
often. Whereas if we had much more that was built collectively,
Mhm.
I think that people could do something that's practical and sort of within reach under the conditions of distressed nervous system states, and
Mhm.
things that might touch on trauma or
Yeah.
experiences of marginalization or all sorts of
Mhm.
things like that. So
Mhm.
I would I would love for there to be generally things that collectivize that from early on. Something that we've just been trying to develop is we've just run a big mediation training program about over a year and a half, in train people up in depth. And the idea of that group, if that group of people, is that they work together as a team of mediators. But we
Mhm.
also, with that, alongside that, are developing this thing a little bit like the idea of how you have breakdown cover for your car. So you have this thing that you pay a little bit of money into or contribute to if you can,
Mhm.
and in an ongoing way, but you have a relationship with. So that thing can maybe, a mediator, if your organization had a relationship with that with a couple of mediators already, and you have
Mm,
a deal with them where they ring you up every, I don't know, month or 2 months and just say, hey, what tensions have you got that you aren't managing to resolve? And
mm,
then that they could come in much sooner because there's already a well trodden pathway between the support and the people who might need that support. And so
mm,
it's not on everyone as an individual to figure this out alone. It's building a kind of collective infrastructure around it.
mm, mm. Yeah, and so yeah, that I'm interested in like your sense of, because what you're sort of describing there does really sound like, so you're there, you're in your organization, you're facing a challenge, get support early.
Mm.
Um, like, do you think it's sort of, is it a necessary part of how you understand the kind of collective approach to this, that we have people in the role of mediators that come in to offer support, versus like an approach that kind of asks everyone to be developing the skills that mean that we can, in our organizations, hold this stuff together well? Yeah.
So my sense is that if you think of it as a system,
Mm,
any intervention in that system or any change in that system will affect the system. So it's possible that, say, you and me are in a group of 15 people or 20 people who organize around some issue together, and say just you go off to a training or read a book or just think quite a bit about how to engage with conflict differently, and then something happens in the group and maybe you're not directly involved or maybe you are, but you see it and you can in some way even just start to talk to the people and hear them and make a space where they get to even recognize that they're having a difficulty, and they have the feeling of someone being alongside them. That's already a huge shift in the system than if you weren't doing that. If a whole bunch of us had gone to some training, it's quite possible that then there's a whole load more capacity in the group. If we all went to a training, that that takes the level up. But still, for me, the going to a training doesn't have the same effect or it may not have the same effect as if we've put in place some very clear agreements that actually shift the system in a very practical way. I think of it a little bit like if you if you've got your friend's key and you keep forgetting to give your friend's key back, and every time you think of it is not the moment that you need to remember it. You remember it when you're in the bath or something like that.
Mhm.
If you then, in a moment where you do remember it, you put the key by the door, it's more likely that you'll take the key with you when you need to. If you put the key in your shoe, knowing that you're going to put those shoes on when you go to see your friend, then you'll remember it in exactly the moment that you need to remember it, because you can't put your shoes on with a
Mhm.
key in your shoe and not notice.
Mhm.
So I quite like thinking of how to develop systems at that level. So we have really practical things that catch us or remind us or give us a doable request in the moment that it's relevant.
Yeah.
So I think that, yeah, developing those things um, takes it up a notch from just us all having gone to a training.
Mhm.
And then I think it's possible, if we're a larger group, it's possible that we define our own process and build the conditions around that in a way that we don't need to call someone in from the outside. My sense of having worked with a lot of organizations and projects to try and develop their systems, often they feel they have the capacity to sort of do the first aid level
Mhm.
internally and then have someone to call from the outside who has spent maybe, yeah, years studying this and years working with the more challenging end of those things
Mm.
that don't resolve.
Yeah.
And then basically what makes sense to me is that you're just increasing the level of support to the level
Mhm.
that's necessary for you to work through the thing. So similar to, I'll do some level of fixing stuff up in my house by myself, and there's some level that I'll call in uh,
Mhm.
a builder for.
Mhm. Sure. Yeah. 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 Hmm. So I wonder if it would be helpful to sort of hear a bit what a sort of like, I guess it's not possible to go into excessive detail in the time we have, but kind of what some of those structures that you're talking about, or the kind of, yeah, the things that catch us, like what some of those things might be, how we might,
Mm.
yeah, just to, yeah, so we all know kind of what we're talking about there.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think for me, almost if you think of a conflict on a timeline, there's different interventions that can be made at different points. So I think often there's stuff that is useful to work out that isn't directly about conflict, but it's the kind of stuff that can often turn into conflict if it's not addressed. So
Mm.
even a really fundamental thing in a group or project or organization is getting really clear on what the purpose of the organization is and is not. And I think often if you don't have real clear shared purpose, if you do have real clear shared purpose, that organizes and shapes things to kind of flow well. And if you don't have a clear shared purpose, that often tends to show up eventually as tension of people pulling in different directions. They're
Yeah.
trying to climb to different mountain tops, and so they pull when they come
Mm.
to a choice point. They're pulling in different directions. So
Mm.
there's things
Mm.
like that, clarifying purpose, or maybe some things around values, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And then also working on other systems, not only conflict systems, but for example, so many conflicts that I come across come down to having some roots in the decision making system within a project or organization, which also has lots to do with power. You made
Yeah.
this decision without consulting me, or that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, getting really clear on how we make decisions or how we share resources, things like that, that
Mhm.
kind of the glitches in any of those systems will turn into eventually it's almost like you could understand conflict as a form of feedback or a signal that something's not working in those systems.
Mhm.
Then I think also things about how we just are doing other functions, like for example, giving and receiving feedback. That if there's a way for me to address something that's not quite working before I get pissed off about it, by just
Mhm.
saying, oh, could you copy me in on those emails as
Mhm.
a standard thing? You might be like, oh, yeah, that's totally fine. I didn't know you wanted to be copied in on
Mhm.
them, but then there's just a thing that can easily be addressed. There's no interpersonal tension. So, getting
Mhm.
really clear processes or systems for giving feedback is another thing that can be the sort of pre work. And another system that I think is super important is something around care and support, and maybe
Mhm.
sort of connection and community building within the thing. So, for example, within Navigate, I can imagine this is the case in lots of different projects. We start and end each meeting with a little check-in. Sometimes it's a much more in-depth check-in about how everyone's been for, at a deeper level. Sometimes it's a very short check-in, just like how are you today?
Mhm.
You that's just a natural thing to a very natural human thing. But us doing that and connecting as humans before we go into a task is another
Mhm.
thing that can set us off in a good direction and help to build the trust, and also start to notice when someone's not getting enough support or someone's struggling with something or whatever quite early on. So all of those things would be pre things that would be quite practical to look at. And it doesn't have to be you have to make all of those things into their perfect state, but just small interventions at that level I think can often help set things in a good direction. And then, as I was saying, getting really clear on how we want to handle conflict.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that there might well be other elements of it, but in my mind in this moment, I'm thinking there's something about sensing conflict early. So, a really practical thing that you could do with that would be, for example, similar to what I just said a minute ago, you could have an agreement that once a month in your, I don't know, monthly meeting within a project, you take 5 minutes in silence, everyone to just note down, are you struggling with something about how we work or how you're interacting with someone or anything that anyone has done? And just, or even it's even 2 minutes, just it's like, okay, we're going to do the little conflict check now that we've agreed. everyone note it down, and then it's like, okay, take 2 minutes to note it down, and then 2 minutes, what are you going to do about it? What have you done about it, and what are you going to do about it?
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
just one way of doing it. There'd be lots of other ways, but something like that that helps people to sense it early, and
Mhm.
then if there is an agreement about what you do, for example, a big poster on the wall, if we meet in a place, or if we organize in a way where we're working in a project where we're working remotely, we print out a little poster and ask everyone to stick it on their own wall in the room that they work in, and make it like a colorful flow chart or a colorful image, something like that, that just gives the different options you have of having a direct conversation, or asking someone within your project perhaps to just come and sit with you silently if it feels like having a direct conversation is a little bit too much or is a little bit too scary, you need a little bit more support, then have someone come and sit with you quietly whilst you're having that conversation, just to help people feel a bit safer. And there's a little bit of nervous system co-regulation that can happen and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And then there's another branch on the flowchart, which is if those don't feel like that's enough support, then we move quickly to increasing the support by, and then it's
Mhm.
not like, oh, someone now has an action point to find a mediator and they're really busy and it ends up taking 3 weeks to find someone. But if you already have a relationship with someone, you've already got in touch with someone, found out who's available in your area or whatever it is
Mhm. Mhm.
beforehand, then you can move much quicker
Mhm.
and you have a relationship with them and you know how they work and this sort of thing. So those would be some of the
Mhm.
practical things that you could put in place. And I'm
Mhm.
always really interested in what creative ideas people have that that aren't that, that ideas that I haven't come across yet. But there's some.
Yes, yeah, great. Really, that's really helpful. Thank you. I guess another sort of aspect that's sort of coming up for me as I listen to those is like um yeah, the sort of the balance between sort of like the individual personal sort of responsibility versus kind of collective and cultural responsibility. And um in a way it feels like so important that we're kind of trying to find, as you're describing there, like practices and structures that can help influence the way the culture in the organization works. And I guess, yeah, and really important, as you said before, that we're not sort of like leaving responsibility to rest on individuals. At the same time, it sort of feels like it is us as individuals that populate those structures, and like who and our minds and hearts basically are at the kind of heart of of
Mm.
how those things play out or not, in a way. And yeah, the ability to be kind of self-aware, the ability to sort of be emotionally literate, the ability to kind of have the sensitivity to know, oh, I think I might have said something that hurt that person there, or like, oh, I seem to be feeling a bit uncomfortable now. What's happening in me? Or, do you know what I mean? It's like, as well as, yeah, it also feels like a lot what can happen with conflict in different ways is that sort of into things that have happened internally get played out externally, in ways that, or misunderstandings that sort of, I'm holding something inside me in a particular way, and it's kind of, and I'm assuming something about what that means externally that is actually to do with me. That sort of the challenge of that kind of the threshold between what's happening inside and outside. And yeah, I guess for me, um that aspect of it is also important. Not that we sort of push the responsibility back onto individuals, but that we as individuals are also kind of going like, yeah, my abilities to, or my skill, my capacity to sort of, develop my awareness, develop my sensitivity, develop my emotional literacy. And there's a kind of gendered aspect to that as well, isn't there? Where, often, because of how socialization has happened, like that work can fall on, people who've been socialized female or whatever.
Totally.
um yeah, it's like, yeah, us all taking responsibility to develop those capacities feels a really important part of this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think that can have, there's so much benefit in that, and there's consequences if people don't do that.
Yeah.
I guess I relate to that as, in general, I relate to responsibility as something that people, they choose to step into, they choose to take
Hmm.
responsibility for things, or they don't.
Hmm.
I'd love for people to to, exactly as you're saying, try to take that orientation and do what they can to develop those awarenesses or those capacities,
Mhm.
and get set up the support they need also to be able
Mm.
to do that. That's something that we try to emphasize a lot in how we work as mediators, is that my capacity to really empathically understand someone isn't a fixed thing. It relates to exactly the things you're saying,
Mhm.
how I engage with things inside of myself,
Mhm.
and the effort and intention that I put on that. And that can also be massively affected by whether I've got support. Have I got someone I can turn to and just say, I've got a load of judgments of this person right now, and
Mhm.
I'd like to just voice those judgments as my first step in seeing if any of those might loosen or shift a little bit. So
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
sort of thing. So I think there's tons that people can do as individuals. I
Mhm.
think that the there is a challenge of, I definitely find this as having, as someone who's tried to study and practice and trying to learn to embody those principles at all levels of my life, from how I engage with myself internally, how I am with my own tensions or
Mhm.
conflicts within myself, internal conflicts, whether
Mhm.
that's interpersonal conflicts in my life,
Mhm.
tensions, etc., all the way through to sort of collective and systemic
Mhm.
levels.
Mhm.
I think that the having really given so much of my life to trying to do that, I still find that there are some situations where I find myself at a loss, at least in the moment, with how to engage with a conflict or a tension. Sometimes just turning to some support, then I come back freshly resourced and with more clarity about what to do. And I think that sometimes there are things where it's just a very natural thing that humans need other humans to hold them in conflict,
Mhm.
and that, yeah, I think that ideally they can all go together, the
Yeah, that's
individual and the collective, and everything that is done, whether that's one individual doing something. Sometimes, just being in a meeting and one individual just breathes a bit deeper, it might shift
yeah.
things in the room, and that you could probably map that even at a neuroscience level, that
Mhm.
we're such relational beings that if I just slow down a little bit or breathe a bit deeper, probably the person next to me might breathe a tiny bit deeper too, perhaps. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, just that sort of a distinction between kind of an individual doing something and a collective practice or whatever, just yeah, it doesn't really hold up in a way, does it? It's like, as you say, I'm having this kind of experience inside me, and the minute I speak to someone about it, that experience shifts, and it's not my experience is relational always in a way. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
and
but
yeah, just really want to emphasize that I think there is tons. Like,
mm,
we could talk for hours about all the things that an individual can
mm,
do at the level of just
mhm,
how they're framing or perceiving a situation,
mm,
and the different ways of working with that internally or with support, and also different moves that you can make in
mhm,
terms of engaging with conflict, whether you're directly involved in that conflict or it's a conflict that you're witnessing close by. There's lots. So yeah,
mhm.
there's absolutely loads that people could look into and study around that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, it's all flooding into my mind, all the things I want to say, and there's this thing, which we don't have time for, yeah. But
Mm,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think yeah, that range in a way just seems important. Yeah.
mm,
Um, so what what seems like most important to you right now, where we're at this moment in terms of this kind of the field of kind of conflict and the ways that that's kind of showing up and kind of causing difficulties for us in our movements and sort of in kind of in getting in the way of our ability to sort of fulfill what is. more and more desperately needing to be fulfilled.
Mm.
Um, what what do you what seems most important? Like, what's the thing that you feel? I don't know if that's a good question, but yeah.
I think probably well, there's two things that come to mind first as you're asking that question. I think I've sort of touched on them both, but one is looking at what patterns are we playing out in how we handle conflict, and who
Hmm.
made those patterns, or where did they come from, and
Hmm.
what are the consequences of those patterns at a human level, like the people who are involved, and how much pain and how much hurt and harm happens from the conflict in the first place, and then how it's responded to if we
Hmm.
follow certain patterns that we might not have chosen and we might not choose and might not align with our actual politics and values,
Hmm.
which I think I've said a few things around that. And then I think something that I've also touched on, but the centrality of conflict and how we handle it to collective power. For
Hmm.
me, I believe in the times that we're in, we need to find ways to come together and organize and sustain a level of collective power that hasn't been hasn't really been seen, I think, in my lifetime in the part of the world that I'm living in anyway. A level of social movement that is not lots of small organizations basically working in quite a separated way to sort of address the more sort of downstream symptoms, but organizing a level of collective power that can go upstream to address the root causes and actually shift the systems that are devastating life on Earth.
Hmm.
And so I think conflict, how we handle conflict, it can, it's almost like it offers us two different pathways or two different doorways. One is conflict can absolutely destroy collective power if we handle it in particular ways. It will get us completely stuck or rip us apart. And often the way that the left handles its conflicts, it sort of does the work of the right for them. Because we fight ourselves so well that we no one else even needs to fight us because we've already kind of defeated ourselves, sort of thing. Which is so tragic and so frustrating, but also so understandable because yeah, we haven't really been shown how to do this. I think in the cultures that a lot of us have grown up in, and at the same time, conflict I think can, if handled in other ways, can actually not just not destroy our collective power, but it can actually evolve it. There's so much learning. There's so much I think of in a way a conflict process. If it goes well, it's a little bit like a system talking with itself, and there's so much. If you and me have a conflict, there's so much that I'm not seeing or I'm not tracking or that I'm not connected to or currently caring about that's over there with you that I won't have access to unless I really engage. And it's so often the case both ways round. So if we bring that together, we bring the different pieces of the puzzle. You've got a bunch of pieces, I've got a bunch of pieces. If we bring them together, we actually can learn so much about our, for example, our ways of working, our decision making system, or our ways of uh, not doing support and care, or whatever it is within our group. So we can actually be strengthened by conflict if we engage with it in certain ways. So for me, I would absolutely love for progressive social movements, the left, to really change its relationship with conflict in a very practical way, to look at conflict as an opportunity to build collective power and to strengthen and evolve our ways of organizing together. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Mm.
I think
Mm.
also there may be something around, and I think that's maybe goes back to something you said earlier, that people maybe just don't have that many positive experiences of engaging with difficult conflicts, and so there isn't a lot of hope or belief sometimes that it is possible to work through it.
Mm.
My personal belief from my experience, and this obviously it's just my perspective, but it's also based on having spent over a decade sort of working with people in conflict
Mm.
in depth a lot, is I've never come across a conflict I think couldn't be worked through if there was willingness
Mm.
to to stick with it. Sometimes it takes a while. Actually, it
Mhm.
doesn't take nearly as long as it took to tangle the rope up. You know, if you've been tangling it up for 2 years, often we can untangle that in a matter of hours or a couple of days or something like that, if
Mhm.
people are really willing to go through the
Mhm.
process. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes there are, going back to something you said earlier around people maybe having, people might be sort of hearing what we're talking about and saying, well, we've done all of that,
Mm.
it didn't work. My sense is often there is some missing piece in the process
Mm.
that um, hasn't quite been brought into the conversation.
Mm.
There can be lots of different reasons, but I think often there's
Mm. Mm.
something that's actually a block in the relationship. Relationally, there's something, and we haven't quite managed to talk about that thing or those things.
Mhm.
And so, yeah,
Mm.
my experience again and again and again is when people actually have the support and the conditions where they can say all of the stuff that's really important, but not only say it, but have it heard, really
Mm.
taken in, and to check whether it's heard in the way that they wanted.
Mhm.
And then sometimes that might also involve, for example, yeah, one of the an example of that, the kind of thing that might stop something from really resolving is, I've said something about the impact a thing had for me, you've kind of heard it, but there's some way in which there's something else that you need to say in response to that before you
Mm.
can fully take it in.
Mm.
But then
Mm.
if that thing is said and I've really heard that, then you can really hear me and something shifts.
Mm.
And I was just in a mediation process a couple of days ago where people came in, some with very, very low trust, a lot of
Mm.
hurt, a lot of pain, and kind of leaning out like, I don't think this is going to work, but I'm willing to give it one last try. And
Mhm.
we got so far. It's a very moving experience.
Mm.
The level of what could change literally in the space of one day between
Mm.
about 8 9 people in a room with
Mhm.
a couple of mediators there to support them. And in a way
Mm.
it was very simple what happened, but in a way it
Mhm.
there's lots of nuances and complexities to it. But yes, I
Mhm.
guess I'd like to convey that to people, that my experience is things really can be transformed even if they don't. And I think often when you're in a conflict it looks like there's no way through it. It looks like a solid wall. Actually, in my experience, it, I've never come across something that I think couldn't be untangled.
Mm. Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. I feel really touched by that. Thank you. Um, yeah, and maybe to sort of continue to end on a positive note. What is inspiring you right now, or what's feeling promising?
I think probably the example that I just said, just because that's
Mm.
very fresh and just happened, and I think the sense that something is shifting, as we've spoken about in this conversation, that it's taking time, and I guess it just will take time, but that people are increasingly understanding the importance of this, or coming to view this as something not just nice to have, but actually crucial
Mm.
to building movements that can transform things and to a better world in itself. That one of the huge problems not only in terms of how we organize to change the world, but just one of the huge problems in the world is how we handle conflict. And I have a sense that something is slowly shifting, and I hope that the more people get to directly experience what it's like to go through conflict transformation, and the more they hear stories of it. I mean, that's part of how I first got into this work. Was I heard one or two people tell stories of people coming together after the most painful things that can happen between humans: war, people being killed,
Mm.
people who'd lost family members to the groups that each other were part of, and that people, even in those circumstances, it's possible for human beings to have a kind of conversation where they go in with that level of pain, that level of absolute devastation, and they walk out of the room like hugging each other, shaking hands, inviting each other around to eat together.
Mm.
When I first heard those stories, it really resonated, rang something very deep in my soul.
Mm.
Heard that, and I knew that that's what I wanted to spend my life doing.
Mm.
And yeah, my sense is that the more people get to witness that, experience that themselves, or hear stories of it,
Mm. Mm.
and the sense that it's possible. And I think that it's almost like sometimes, there's been mountains or rock faces where it was like there's no way you can climb this, and then as soon as one person did it, then
Mm.
the whole story flipped, and it's like, oh, it is possible, even if it's extremely difficult, it is
Mm.
possible. And that really changes the world, I think, for
Mm.
me, when I realize, oh, it's not stuck forever. If
Mhm.
someone
Mm.
could find a way through, maybe we could find a way through too.
Mm. Yeah. 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 Stories.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how useful I found it, when I was preparing for birth, how useful I found it to just read hundreds of birth stories. And,
Mm.
just like what you learn, it's a different thing from being told how to do something. You just sort of like learn so much in such different ways from stories, don't you? And I'm sort of thinking, oh, maybe that should be your next big project, like putting together a book of stories from your
Mm.
mediation life. Yeah. Yeah, because I think that can have, as you say, such a transformative effect for people to, yeah, really, really, yeah, feel that sense of possibility as well as like, yeah, gain learning in a slightly different and more sort of more full way or something. Mm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I really like that idea of somehow telling the stories, and it's
Mm.
like one story of transformation has way more power than 100 stories that we've heard before of things not being worked out, because it opens up the possibility. We may or may not find it, but knowing that it's possible,
Mm.
something, for me at least, something feels very different about a world in which it is possible to work through the
Mhm.
most difficult things.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Mm. Good. Thank you for this. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you would want to answer?
Maybe I just finish with a a quote. I won't go because the actual quote itself is a little long and complicated, but there's this woman called Mary Parker Follett who was around 100 years ago,
Mhm.
and she's actually influenced the worlds of conflict transformation and other things a lot, but she's not that well recognized, I think, probably because she was a woman writing in sort of early 20th century. But so she has a thing that she just laid out, and I'll just sort of paraphrase it. She said basically there are three ways of handling difference: there's domination, there's what she called compromise, meaning a sort of, okay, fine, I'll give you this if you give me that, where the relationship is not actually the relationship is still adversarial and not collaborative. So there's domination, basically win lose. There's sort of some lose lose, and the relationship is still in a bad position or even in a worse position. And there's something that you could call win win. There's what she called it integration. And yeah, she said by domination, one side gets what it wants. By compromise, neither side gets what it wants. By integration, we can find a way that everyone gets what they wish or what they really want. And I like this quote, and I like it. I like saying it because there's something about the simplicity of it in every situation. Something's like you're in the middle of a meeting and someone's just said something and someone else just said something else, and we're getting a bit stuck or the tension is rising. Which of those three options are we looking for? Is there a way that we can say, okay, so this is important to you and this is important to you? What could we do that would address both of those things? Just that move on a really practical level, just asking ourselves that question in any and every situation. If those are three options, which are we going to choose? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. Good. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
we'll see each other down the road, I expect. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for the work you're doing. I really appreciate you.